program. I'm George Jackson, VP of Events at GovExec. I'll be your host and moderator for this discussion. It is titled Open Source Solutions, Transforming Federal Supply Chain Security. Really important, one of the key sessions of the entire day, and it's going to bring a lot of stuff together. Let me give you a little context before we kick off. The federal government heavily relies on diverse products and services for critical functions, but the global supply chain for these technologies faces constant threats from nation-state and criminal actors. OMB and NIST have issued guidance outlining steps for secure software development. While aimed at federal agencies and their providers, wider industry adoption could help prevent cyber attacks on the global supply chain. I got a great group of panelists here with me today. I'll introduce them one by one. Right next to me, John Boyens. He is at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, serving as their Deputy Chief of the Computer Security Division. Always a pleasure, John. Good to see you. Right next to him, the Assistant Director of Supply Chain and Cyber Directorate at the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, Jeanette McMillan. She is a soundbite machine, folks. Stick around. No pressure, no pressure. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency's SCRIM Program Lead, Sean Leblanovitz. Pronunciation correct? Point for me. Last but not least, Qualys VP of Product Security, Alex Kryline. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
So this nexus, John, between open source and supply chain, I'd like you to kick off just a round robin because, you know, to the lay person like myself, seems niche. It's not. It's growing in importance. Talk about where that falls in your portfolio. What part of your portfolio devoted to open source supply chain?
I don't know about percent of portfolio. I can tell you within the last couple of years, it has received increased attention from the administration. So, and this kind of ran in parallel to Executive Order 14028, which dealt heavily with software security and the software supply chain. But in parallel to that, there was an effort out of the Office of the National Cyber Directorate looking specifically at open source software. I think within the last 6 months, they released a report titled Building Blocks, something like that, but it's out there. They'll actually be speaking tomorrow at the Software and Supply Chain Assurance Forum. If anybody wants to go to it, it's out in MITRE, in person only. But the effort is a recognition that open source software does create some security issues, and that even with proprietary software, it relies heavily upon open source software. So it's the big question is, a couple years ago, we had a virtual workshop to look at the different aspects of what should we prioritize when we're looking at this. And there's a whole NSF kind of report on kind of a roadmap in different aspects. Memory safety language was obviously out there. But.
Jeanette, I've heard you speak at past events on how you almost need to educate folks that software is a big part of the supply chain. Can you talk about that and maybe the old infrastructure way of thinking, how that's changing a bit?
Yeah, absolutely, George. First of all, thank you all so much for joining us, especially right after the lunch hour. I know it's the waiting to try to get people up a little bit. I often say that this is the best hour because they save it for supply chain, and we get to listen to the smooth sounds of supply chain risk management.
Dulcet tones.
There we
of
go.
Supply
There we
chain.
go. But it is really true because supply chain, and especially the cyber supply chain, has just taken off by leaps and bounds. And what is that built on? That's built on our software. It's built on our firmware. It's built on our hardware, and it is everywhere. When's the last time you all tried to, as my other panelist Amy said, hail a cab? Paid with cash. done anything without a software-enabled capability, and it's only going to grow, and it's only going to get even more pervasive. And where I sit at the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, we also see that as the main threat vector for foreign adversaries, for nation-state actors, for those folks that are hoping, waiting, wishing that you're not following NIST software secure framework, that they're not following cyber supply chain risk management that Sean takes care of, or more importantly, that they don't have a vigilant CISO like Alex. That's why we have to make sure that we are absolutely on the forefront of where software and supply chains come together, because I don't know a supply chain, if you can tell me one, that doesn't have cyber-enabled capabilities, I'd like to see that. And I'd also like to see that that particular supply chain doesn't have the efficiencies, the economy, or the scale that we needed to in order to get to the next level. So where we focused here, obviously, is on that technology piece and the technologies that we're going to need going forward. 5 critical technologies that the National Counterintelligence and Security Center are focused on: quantum, AI, bioeconomy, semiconductors, and autonomous vehicles. Did I get any of those wrong? Let me know. But that's exactly why we believe that the cyber supply chain that enables all of those technologies is the one that we need to focus on from a threat perspective.
C-SCRIM, I mentioned at the top. Jeanette just translated, but where does software fall in C-SCRIM?
Everywhere, right? To Jeanette's point, it's all over the supply chain itself, right? But what we try to do at CISA is, I like that you talked about resilience and risk management, the R&Rs, right? Which is not rest and relaxation. It really is being able to understand what it is I'm looking at, right? So raise your hand if you're a parent. Okay, so let's just say you have 2 kids, and you know what those 2 kids are like, what they stand for, because you're instilling it in them. Now imagine you have 10 more kids show up at your house, right? That's what we're thinking about and looking at with the supply chain. Open source software means I'm taking in other things I'm not necessarily sure where it comes from, and I don't understand that belief system. Is that belief system built upon strong security? Is it built upon transparency and information sharing? Or is it just meant to be pervasive, right? So if we are going to tackle risk, we need to understand what risk is, right? And how to translate that to our own environments, right? Because what's important to Jeanette may not be as important to me, right? And vice versa. So what we do, right, if we're looking across the supply chain spectrum, I'm going to start at the beginning, right? Because before I begin to go and buy something, I need to understand who that company is. And then I also have to do continuous monitoring. I can't say you're perfect up front, but something else might go awry in the middle 2 or 3 years later. So how can we make sure that we're effectively doing risk management? And then how do we offboard? We don't have enough conversations about offboarding when things aren't the best. How do I have good backups to make sure that I have a new company that can come in and have continuity, right, with the service that I'm offering? Okay, let me stop.
I think you should keep going.
I do want to come back to offboarding, but before we get there, Alex, your background is so unique. And
oh, great.
I'd like you to give a little bit of that to the audience, but also talk a bit about why now? Why has this topic become so critically important? We've heard a little bit throughout today's program, Log4j, SolarWinds, other areas, but why now?
So I'm going to do those in reverse order. I'm going to start with why now, and then I'll talk about the least important part, which is my background. So I think the why now piece is because there's become a general recognition that 2 principles are true at the same time. The first is that we were wrong, that all bugs are not shallow if they're in open source. That's the presumption, right, is that something is libre or gratis and therefore can be viewed and accessible by anybody, and therefore we can trust these maintainers of these projects because they, essentially the masses will solve these problems for us. And then what we find out is whether it's with exautils or whether it's with Heartbleed, that ultimately most of these things just come down to, 3 people, maybe 5. All people are open to bribery, corruption, extortion, mistakes. All of those 5 people are also still people, and therefore they're all vulnerable to the same problems. Second piece is that the adversary that we really have with the one that has no intentionality is time. Software ages like milk. Attackers' capabilities age like fine wine. So the battle that we're actually fighting has very little oftentimes to do with intentionality so much as just with age. So like if I look at, one of the things that I was really stunned by, our CEO Sumedh in the opening keynote talked about how, when we look at what we have in terms of Qualys data, we find that 80% of vulnerabilities are high in terms of CVSS, okay? And I would offer that I would bet $5 that if we looked at those vulnerabilities, we would find that most of them are many versions back from the main version that is currently the top supported version. And so what is happening is that tech debt presents as security debt, but it's not security debt. Security is the thing, it's the symptom that we see, right? Because when you let a dependency or a library go long enough, somebody's gonna find a CVE on it, and then it's gonna register in a scanner, and then I'm gonna have to patch it. And if I don't patch it in conformance with the standards and requirements under RA5 for FedRAMP, I'm gonna get a phone call that says, why are you careless, right? And the challenge is that the enemy that we really have to face are things that are very specifically intentional, and that's where we lack, I think, effective information to make good decisions, right? So I came to that by starting my career as a policy wonk here in DC. I actually started my career as applying on monster.com to a value-added reseller and starting in sales and finding out that it wasn't really for me because I wanted to know more things than that career gave me a capacity to do. And I moved to DC and, long story, worked on the Hill and other agencies and wanted to be a continued good steward of the principles and practices that people like Sean and Jeanette and John and I all care about. And I had the good opportunity to work in startups, be a CISO, and then come eventually here to Qualys where we have this wonderful thought process about how we can help people address the core problems we just talked about.
In my ongoing effort to personalize these discussions for all of you, you can get a personalized technology debt report out in the demo station. So just file that away. Let's talk about guidance, John. NIST puts together guidance. I'll come to you on this as well, Sean, but what kind of guidance is out there for open source software, and how do you hope this community, the IT, security, cloud-based community, how do you hope they use it?
So I'll say most of the guidance that NIST puts out is organizational specific. So our mission originally started out with providing guidance to departments and agencies. It expanded a little bit to industry over the last decade. Recently, we put out some foundational guidance on managing cybersecurity risk in supply chains. I would say back in 2018, we took a little shift to the left and started providing guidance in the form of a framework for developing secure software. And that's special publication 800-218, which is our secure software development framework. It's not just focused on open source software, it's any sort of DevSecOps. So it's not specific OSS, but right now we have a project at the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, which is trying to implement some of these standards and guidelines in this framework for different applications and different types of software, including open source.
Sean?
I've been in supply chain. We started tinkling with it in 2011. And my message is still the same, to the point where people may be tired of hearing me say it. You take the basic principles of people, processes, and technology. People, am I giving people the right information, right, so that they can make better decisions about what they do? Don't download stuff you don't know where it comes from, right? Understanding process. Do I have a way to talk with my acquisition professionals when they're getting ready to do new contracts? Do they understand why I'm so passionate about the risks that we're dealing with? And do I understand their constraints from an acquisition perspective, right? When I was at GSA, the most important thing I learned was the other side of the fence, right? What they have to go through. So making sure that we have good processes to understand each side and where we can meet in the middle. That last part is technology, right? Asset management is so fundamental. It sounds so elementary, but if we can at least understand what's in our environment, understand what's legacy and it's been there for 25 years and hadn't been patched in the last 20 years, then we can make real efforts to change and do better.
Does that look different at ODNI, Jeanette? And I guess why I ask is the data that you deal with on a day-to-day basis, there are different definitions of
Absolutely.
that. I mean, secret, top secret, others, like, does that, what Sean lays out there, does it look different at ODNI?
It does and it doesn't, but to both of my colleagues here, we have definitely taken that to heart within the intelligence community, and there is a specific intelligence community directive that is out there on the open. If you go to odni.gov, you will be able to see it. It's called ICD 731, and that has been out there for a decade. That's been out there since 2013, just basically saying this is how we in the community are going to do supply chain risk management, which includes acquisition of software, an acquisition of software that is going to touch that data. And that particular directive is based in part on NIST standards. So when we've got the best standards in the world, people, okay, I'm telling you. So we can leverage those standards to bring that into the intelligence community to look at and protect those things as we're bringing in that data, understanding where it's coming from, understanding what those vendors are doing. That's definitely a leg up for us in terms of leveraging the know-how from the federal space into the intelligence community, which to your point is certainly where we keep some of our most sensitive data according with the national security standards. So bringing that allows us to level up, but at the same time keep those standards together for software developers. We don't buy any secret software. There's only one software supply chain, right? So that is something that we bring into our community, knowing that those standards that NIST has put out and then following that risk management framework that Sean talked about, we do that holistically every single day.
What do you see as some of the strengths and weaknesses, Alex, of the guidance that's out there right now and maybe positioning public sector for the future of security?
So I think the strength is that there's a lot of great information that is understandable by trained practitioners. I think the weakness is that there's way too much guidance that's out there and most people have no training on how to understand it. So like blunt feedback, I oftentimes give NIST documentation to software developers with no experience in cybersecurity. Why? Because they write the code. It's not a great outcome. It doesn't generally go well because they don't understand the language that it's written around, and it's like asking somebody to be appreciative of like Mozart's opera when the only thing that they have a background in is like Metallica, right? And it's like that's challenging because we're not speaking the same language. What I would love to see more of is information that is written for software developers about security and not information that is written for security teams to tell their software developers that they should care, right? Like, I think the problem of our time is communication. We also lack a lot of empathy, right? Like, I have a huge amount of appreciation for the extremely talented software developers that work at our company and a lot of others. But the time pressure constraint is tremendous. And we are only making it harder for them by using coded language and things that are inconsistent and things that don't really make them feel like they can be successful, right? We need to give developers a success option. And so like that's why I'm so appreciative of Security by Design, which is one of the reasons why Qualys signed the Security by Design pledge, because our goal is to make things easier to understand for people who work at our company, but then also easier to understand for the people who are entitled to use the products that we build, right? You can't have customer delight if we're letting down customers, and we can't support customers if the people who build our products can't understand what they need to do.
Artificial intelligence has been at least part of every conversation on stage here. And Sean, I'll give you a
Because
little.
the bots want us
Yeah.
to talk about it. Yeah, okay.
But I remember a conversation I had with a DoD leader around artificial intelligence, and that person was, detailing a similar concern to yours, that there's a lot out there, it's tough to keep up with, and this person had decided to build an artificial intelligence bot solution just simply to keep up with all of the guidance and the memos and the legislation and other elements that were impacting that organization's approach to artificial intelligence. I mean, Sean, do you see that as something ultimately that artificial intelligence could be applied to across government?
Listen, artificial intelligence can be a beautiful tool for us to use, right? They call it artificial intelligence for a reason, though, because it's nothing until we make it something. And we have to put in quality, good information to get out what we want.
Yes.
1. 2, we really need to understand how to apply it, right? Again, I love analogies. If I gave my 14-year-old a Ferrari, she's gonna wreck it, right? She's not skilled to drive that car yet, right? She hasn't had any training. And if we just tell people to go use artificial intelligence in their environments, it's like wrecking a car, right? So we've got EOs that are coming out about it. John and his team are putting out great things about it. Again, to Jeanette's point, let's use the standard. Let's figure out what it is we want to accomplish and smartly figure out how to use it. But what we can do with it is amazing. It's amazing, but we got to know how to use it and apply it.
Well, let's dig into that, John. 22-18, what are some key steps in there? What should agencies maybe tackle first as they try and wrap their arms around this?
So, a little background on Memo 2218 is part of Executive Order 14028, requiring departments and agencies to get a software attestation from suppliers that they have followed NIST guidance regarding secure software development framework. Now, NIST guidance, the SSDF, are these high-level outcomes that map to different standards and practices. So it gets very complex very quickly. So when you're asking for these attestations, there needs to be a way, and I think this is one of the challenges government has had in implementing that, is finding a way to boil that up into a certain high-level language of practices that suppliers of software can attest to. So when you go into the memo, that's kind of what it's getting at. And part of the memo is related to the software attestation form which Sean and her team put together, right? And that boils it up a little bit more into what companies have to attest to. And a lot of those things that they're attesting to, and the document is great because in one of the appendices, it takes the actual requirements, what companies are attesting to, maps it to the executive order, and then maps it to the actual practices within the SSDF. But a lot of those practices are, and NIST did a lot of research in this. We talked to a lot of software developers. They're basic, kind of hygienic practices that every software developer should be doing. So I think it does boil it up to a point to be very understandable, but also offers access into the more detailed aspects of software development.
Jeanette, when organizations are doing this right, what do they see at a tangible level? What changes about their supply chains?
Well, for me, I think they definitely need to look beyond just the actual software in terms of that second and third tier contributor, almost like open source contributors, right? Like who else is providing this piece and that piece? And if you're really looking at it, and again, the software supply chain is one of the most opaque supply chains that are around, but we know it works. We know that if I put this piece and this piece, I put it together, it's gonna work, great, this was the requirement is met. But what we like to look for is the extra features. when it starts to phone home to a different various country of concern. So that's where we're like, well, yeah, it's a feature, but do we really need that feature to operate? And more importantly, is that a flag that we need to say to that particular developer, before you deliver this to me as a customer, whether I'm a federal government customer or a DIB customer or someone else, do I want those features enabled? Do I even know that those features are there just because those things are together? So I think to John's point, it's about just making sure everyone is leveling up when they are sharing these pieces and parts, because everyone wants to get their software. We want the update, we want it on time, we want it to be able to throw it against these hard data sets so that we can really get after the really hard problems that AI is supposed to help us with. But by introducing AI, are we reintroducing additional risks because we don't know what's really making up that algorithm? So that's why when I see those pieces pulled together, having everyone look at that from a risk perspective and an enterprise risk perspective, not just that supply chain perspective, I think people it'll be a force multiplier to say, okay, finally, I may be secure over here, but is that supply chain introducing risk I had not even thought about?
Alex, it makes me think of our conversation in the green room, and I'm going to pull out two simple words from that: risk and vulnerability. Why is the difference between those two really important here?
Well, if you want to get anything done at a company, then managing towards the vulnerability is not going to be a productive way to do that. I can't overemphasize this enough, and maybe this isn't something everybody on the stage is aligned with, but like, okay, think about it this way. EPSS is a project of first.org, and it's the, I'm forgetting what it stands for, but it's their predictive scoring system. They did an estimation using a large data set model where they basically said that only between 2 and 7% of vulnerabilities have a known exploit. So if I'm taking a totally CVSS-driven approach, and I'm going to my software engineers and saying, you have to patch on the order of criticality instead of the order of risk, what I'm really asking them to do is waste 92 to 98% of their time, right? Which means that when things are actually urgent and important, there's not time left for that, right? So like, I just functionally reject the premise, especially in application security, that like a CVSS-driven approach is an acceptable framework. I also noticed in the secure software development framework, it asks developers to manage towards risk, not towards criticality. And I'm wondering maybe if that was an intentional delineation. I'm hoping that it was, because where I struggle is to get outcomes created. And I can't create an outcome for customers if I'm trying to get my engineers to block and tackle things on priority that are not actually priority problems. Beyond that, we're also missing a last component, because that only addresses the problem in the context of technology. But I'm interested to know if that dependency has an exploit that isn't picked up by a scanner because it doesn't get a lookup in National Vulnerability Database, but instead has malware. What should I do with the author of that commit? Should I ban that author throughout my organization? What if that author contributes code to a core Linux project? Should I no longer use Linux? We're a critical infrastructure and key resources sector customer. We gain almost no threat intelligence on any of these questions from anybody in this town. We'd like to, and I think we can do better under partnership.
Yeah.
But that's a very serious question, because authors have intentional action. Vulnerability is just the tool that they use to get the job done that they need.
All three of your fellow panelists have spectacular, active listening faces. But Jeanette, I'm going to come to you first, and then if either of you want to weigh in, you're welcome to. Just flag me down.
Captures the audience.
I was exactly. I was just going to piggyback on that in terms of just the risk equation. And one of those things that we've often said is that you have to look at the threat, the vulnerability to your system, and then that threat plus vulnerability equals consequence. What's the consequence of that? And then that really does give you your risk. And then within that consequence, part of the equation, you're also adding in those mitigations. You're adding in, okay, fine, is this development for a piece of software or a critical piece of the Linux, code that no one else is working on.
Yeah.
There's like 3 people that are actually maintaining this for the entire, internet user base,
Yes.
right? Like, okay. So where do you pull those things in together? And I think that's where people really have to understand that information sharing is really critically part of it. And what we've done in the community, at least from our perspective, like I said, we've been doing this for a little over a decade now. Can we do it better? Yes. And so who asked us to do better? Congress did. So Congress said, hey, you guys have been doing this for a little bit. Is there information that you can share with your federal partners, with your sector risk management agencies, so that those that are helping out with critical infrastructure sectors and sectors that are in that sweet spot of the 16 different critical infrastructure areas, is that an opportunity for us to share that information where we've identified this as a specific risk? But again, that might be something that's tolerable. That might be something that's tolerable for that community or that, but when it's not tolerable for another one, you can at least manage that risk in a way that you understand what it's going to mean to that particular sector and that particular base. And I think that's one of the points that we have to figure out in terms of that criticality after you've done that risk-based approach.
Agreed.
Sean?
One thing I want to add to that is understanding the difference between vulnerability and risk. Because sometimes we think that if we mitigate the vulnerability that we've lowered the risk, threshold, it may not always be the case. So whether we're speaking to our leadership or to the engineers that have the boots on the ground, really understanding what problem are you trying to solve, right? Super important. So making sure that we take a few minutes to understand, am I trying to solve a problem with mitigating a vulnerability, or am I trying to change my risk profile?
John, I want to come to you with that to complete our round robin here. But Sean, before I do, Jeanette mentioned that sharing of information. And where CISA sits, you not only share information with all of government, you share information with the private sector. Where are you happy with that level of sharing, and where do you need a little bit more oomph?
I think we always have opportunities to improve, but I can tell you from a intelligence standpoint, Odie and I, Jeanette and her team have been fabulous, right? I have the FAST team under me, which is really critical to some of the work that we're doing in the information sharing arena. Excellent. John has been a longtime colleague and partner, right? Even when he's thinking about new policy and procedures, just having conversations, will this work if we do this, right? And being able to offer some recommendations on how we can better help our government, super important. So I think from a partnership perspective in government, we're doing a pretty good job. I think when it comes to industry, we can do a little bit better. There are so many things that we can learn from industry, but I also think we can do a better job in explaining why we're going the path in which we're going to get better buy-in. This isn't something where industry can sit on this side and the government can sit on the other. We have to be able to walk this path together if we're going to have any chance, right, of reducing some of the risk profiles that we're seeing right now across our nation.
John?
So, sharing information, I would say, it's part of NIST's kind of lifeblood, our work with industry, because when we put out different security guidance, we are admittedly in somewhat of an ivory tower, right? We put out this guidance, but we don't build the products, we don't run the services, we don't develop the software. So we have to work with industry to find that middle ground of what type of security we can actually provide guidance for that is reasonable, practical, and actionable. And we can only do that by working with industry. So industry has always given us a lot of really good feedback. We try to always be open, transparent, technology neutral when we deal with industry. And it's kind of an honest, open, here's all my cards, open kimono. And that type of sharing of information has worked well for us. I think it works less well when both the government says, here's our requirements, they're aspirational, we want industry to do this. Industry says, well, it's a global market. The federal government's market is this big. Maybe not, right? Maybe we're not going to do this. And I think the my way or the highway is decades old. I think we're moving away from that in a good way, and I hope we keep continuing doing that.
I don't know if I would totally agree, because the other side of the argument is NIST publishes best practices and standards. The Security Exchange Commission enforces those best practices and standards under criminal procedure, right? So like when you don't follow the standards and practices and you're a publicly traded company, you're viewed as negligent. And like that's what we're finding out with Tim Brown in the SolarWinds discussion. And I'm not entirely sure I'm comfortable with the idea that everyone is on the same page, that it's just guidance.
So I don't think that's anything different than what I said. I said when NIST is developing guidance, not what others do with that guidance, which is completely different. NIST is non-regulatory. NIST is non-regulatory. We always have been. So if there's something we can change in that process to make it non-regulatory, we'd be open to that.
Let me switch gears at this point. And talk a little bit about malware, Jeanette. Could you just kind of tee up a conversation for what happens if something gets introduced via open source? What does that trigger for an organization? What's the after action or the paces that you have to put stuff through in order to sort of rectify the situation?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And while we're not necessarily boots on the ground, as Sean has said before, it basically impacts that entire data set. And it impacts the usability and the reliability. I mean, I'm a recovering attorney from CIA, but so CIA back then was different, but CIA now is the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of that data. Can we make the right decisions based upon the data, knowing that that malware is in there doing things? And as we've already seen, some of our FBI director, Jen Easterly at CISA has already said some of these things in places in different parts of our infrastructure and ecosystem are not there for the traditional things that we would normally find them there for. And so what is it that particular system is now operating? Sure, you can see everything bouncing along and everything seems to be working. The lights are literally still on, but what else is that going on? What sort of information is being gathered in that data, and what does that really look like? And more importantly, can we go in and extract it without damaging any other piece parts of the system? So I think that's where that comes into that communication and that conversation. It's not just a cybersecurity thing. It is certainly a holistic thing where everyone needs to bring in all bat. What is it? The bat signal needs to go up, and all of the superheroes need to get together and say exactly what does this mean for not only the actual infrastructure, but the data, the decisions, and then also the human beings that actually have to respond to it. So it is definitely an issue, and malware is absolutely prolific right now where we're dealing with it within the critical infrastructure sector.
Sean, she didn't use this word, but it speaks to transparency for me. I mean, what happens government-wide once those types of vulnerabilities are, exploited, I guess?
Yeah, right. So I'm going to say we're going to assume that we all know that everyone's going to work to mitigate, but that back piece, that strategy piece is, my first question is, what did I say in my contract that I held that vendor accountable for, right? What did my internal policy tell my sysadmins and my system engineers what they should and shouldn't do, right? And then I'm going to say, well, who else is affected? Because it'll depend on which way that I go. I think the main thing that is affected that we often don't talk about, it shakes our confidence, right? Everyone is working so hard and we think we're making advances in this space, and when something like a SolarWinds happens, it does shake our confidence and causes us to go back and sort of reflect on how we can do things differently. I think from a transparency standpoint, if we learn right at another agency that they are doing things super well, let's learn from that so that we can implement them in agencies where they're struggling. But I also think that we need to really try to even the playing field, right? We still in this day and time have agencies that can't spell scrum. And I don't mean that to be funny, right? They're struggling. Like, where do I start with this?
Yeah.
So if we don't have everyone at the table and understand the language in which we're speaking, then they can't go back and do anything, right? So I think part of that transparency is really making sure that we throw lifelines to others that are kind of drowning right now.
Sir?
Well, we can't have a conversation about supply chain, I'm pretty sure, without saying the word S-bomb. So I'll be the first to introduce that in the conversation. So thank you. The ghost of Alan Friedman appeared and everybody clapped.
Yes.
So the software supply chain, I think, focus that a lot of people in the private sector are focused on is building and developing software bill of materials. And in part doing that, at least for a lot of my colleagues, because we want developers to know what they're using in the code that they're writing. Like, that's actually part of the value proposition. I don't think it's about security. I think it's about giving developers transparency into what code that they're writing. Like, most people didn't write the whole application. Like, if you're a software developer, I doubt that you wrote the whole application, right? You're inheriting that from a bunch of other people who already left the company, or you're in a team of 15 people and some time went by and you don't know what's going on. So the SBOM helps us get there, and then taking that seriously to look through those dependencies helps us identify malware that may be in those dependencies that isn't going to come up if you just check version number on NVD. That doesn't actually come up, and that's part of the problem. Is I don't think people understand the limits of these tools, but informing that with more information from government partners is, I think, a missing piece that would be valuable, at least for me. It helped me run a better PCERT. It helped me run a better supply chain program.
It's a robust conversation. We're actually over by 19 seconds, so I am sorry to cut it short.
But it was worth it.
But I really want to thank all four of my wonderful panelists today: John Boyens, Jeanette McMillan, Sean Leblanovitz,
Good job.
2 for 2, and you, last but not least, Alex Kryline.